All right. Thank you very much for waiting, and thank you for coming today. My name is Winnie. I am currently a graduate student at NYU's ITP program, and I was born and have lived in Hong Kong for most of my life. And today I'm going to spend a little bit of time to talk about the protests that have been ongoing for the past 7 months, as well as share with you a series of data-driven projects that I started last term. So a bit about the protest. So it started in March and exacerbated in June of 2019. And it started because of the introduction of an extradition bill that many fear will lead to politically motivated prosecutions and also erode the city's high degree of autonomy that was promised under this one country, two systems principle. So far we've seen many mass protests, we've seen allegations of police brutality and sexual misconduct, and we've also seen an armed and indiscriminate mobster attack against subway commuters. So my role in sharing these projects with you today is mostly one of an observer. For the most part, aside from the last month and a half, I have been here in New York. So my perspective may not be entirely representative of those who are on the ground. I will never understand what it's like to be hit by tear gas every week, nor will I ever be able to imagine what it's like to have to carry a will when you go to a protest when you're only 16. So while I may not be the most legitimate person to talk about this issue or to be making these work, I do think it is important to think about the relationship between technology and social movement, and also within this community to think about how might we use computational approaches, as my friend Seho would say, to find strategies to embrace chaos. So today I'm going to be sharing 4 works as well as a work in process with you. These are all data-driven projects where I try to investigate non-traditional ways of resistance and resilience. And in each of these projects, I try to focus on a different protest artifact to explore the relationship between narrative and distance, whether that is my physical distance being 8,000 miles away from events I deeply care about, the distance between pro-establishment narrative and pro-democratic narratives, or the distance in media rhetoric or interpretation. So there are some questions that I think about while I was creating these work. One, what would restorative approaches towards resistance and resilience look like? Who would be my target audience? And could computational approaches facilitate that? If yes, to what extent? The first project I'm going to share is On My Mind. This is a data portrait of all the protest information I've consumed through online media from September up until today. So the process behind this project is quite manual. Essentially, every time I come across protest information on my phone or on my laptop, I would take a screenshot. Oftentimes, I'll go back to my browser history and I record the date, the time, how I access that information, whether it's through direct search, whether it's forwarded by friends or through social media. And I also try to include a link to the article when I can. This is what the visualization looks like. So on the x-axis, you have the date, and on the y-axis, you have the time from midnight up until 11 p.m. So the color of the boxes indicates the number of articles I've consumed in that hour. The brighter the boxes, the more articles I've read in that hour. And as you hover over it, you can see the screenshots of the article pop up. This data portrait is also very telling of my sleeping habits, which is absolutely terrible. It seems like I only sleep at 3 to 4 a.m. A professor, actually Tom, noted that it seems like I would read a lot of information and then I get burnout, so I stop, and then I kind of go back again and read a lot again. Which is quite true, especially towards as the movement goes on, and also the last month and a half when I was back home consuming information in a very different way, and also it was a very strange experience to be back. Something that I hadn't expected is that while this piece is quite personal, it seems like people who are outside of the context and may not identify as closely with the situation in Hong Kong also resonate with the piece. And I think it's because it does speak to this shared experience that many of us have, that is that we've all been far away from situations or events that we care about. And it seems like in those situations, in order to deal with this guilt and anxiety that we have, one of the common ways we resort to is to consume as much as we can, whether as an act of solidarity or just to bridge that disconnect we feel because we weren't there. The second and third project I'm going to talk about has to do with police press conferences. So starting August 2019, the Hong Kong Police Force have been hosting these press conferences to address issues pertaining to the protests. And I've watched a few of these live streams, and it's really difficult to hear the police's response. Here are some of the examples of popular responses that circulated among protesters. The woman was wearing a dress. The fight was too intense. Therefore, you saw what you saw on the camera. This was in response to a group of police were arresting this female protester and had exposed her. This came from a Cantonese translation. Not perfect, is acceptable, but still have room for improvement. This was in response to planting evidence, and this was also from a Cantonese translation. So this was the former police chief replying to a reporter asking about arresting people in hospital. I know arresting people in hospital may sound, I can't find the right word. So while it was really difficult to hear the police response, I'm also aware of the danger of ignoring it, because that will just create an echo chamber. So I became curious whether I could use computational approaches to help me deal with this mental and emotional inability to confront pro-establishment narratives that I don't necessarily agree with. So what I ended up doing is I created 2 generative text projects, and I found these YouTube videos of the police press conferences online, and so the press conferences are mostly conducted in Cantonese, but these Chinese state-owned media actually uploaded videos with an English simultaneous interpretation onto their YouTube channels. So what I did is that I used YouTube DL, a command line program, to scrape all the English auto caption from over 120 videos, and eventually arrived at a source text that was 627 pages long. So the compiled text isn't perfect. There are a lot of inaccuracy and grammatical mistakes, but that didn't bother me a lot because, well, first it's the police's narrative, and also because I think there is a parallel between a machine-generated text and also a authoritarian narrative, in the sense that this dominant narrative is just imposed onto the protesters with a logical amount. Initially, I also thought about contrasting police press conferences with citizen press conferences that were initiated by protesters as counter-narrative, but in the latter case, the accuracy of that transcript would actually be important to me, so I didn't do it. So there are 2 things I did with the source text. I did some text analysis to see what were the most common words, and also created generated text pieces that I read out loud. So with the generative text, I'm not going to go too much into the methodologies, but these are some of the code that I was working with, essentially because the transcript is just this long words without any punctuations. I broke them up into sentences of about like 20 words long, and then I feed them into, I filter them with keywords and feed them into a markup chain and cut up structure that kind of looks like this. I'm going to read one of these pieces to you now. Hong Kong Police Daily 4 p.m. Briefing. Topic, Women. 3 of 5. 2. Hong Kong police are using different lethal weapons to conduct a dispersal operation. Some radical demonstrators did a more for the police say. They arrested Weldy. Allegation that the organizers station smashing of facilities and even victimizing innocent citizens. At one point, a female protester and a female protester fell to the ground, and this police officer. Of women, we will obtain. So last week, we already sent the warrant to. First court appearance was on the same day at the West County Magistrates Court, but since that woman claimed to. smashing up facilities, and even victimizing innocent citizens at one point, a female passenger. We do not dismiss any possibilities. Not perfect, is acceptable, but still have room for improvement. 3. Hong Kong Police Force Ordinance Chapter 200 of the Notice. This would not be committed if the protesters, they were alleged to have gone beyond basically subdued and willfully obstructing and interfering. Yes, of all the incident, yeah. Mong Kok Police Station last night, like I said at the beginning, that woman. Police fired in backgrounds, a woman. Irritation as a result. On another occasion, one activist claimed that some female arrested people were sexually harassed by our, who arrested 18 males, 16 females aged between. Here's other woman. What was the first question involving sun opening? Please, the number of interview routes as far as. I know arresting people in hospital may sound, I can't find the right word. Not perfect, it's acceptable, but still have room for improvement. So the second project I did was that I looked at that list of most frequently used words in the transcript, and I thought, oh, this will be perfect for fridge magnets. So that's what I did. I made fridge magnets out of the most frequently used 300 or so words in the transcript, and I titled that Magnetic Bullshit, Hong Kong Police Edition. I asked people to create sentences starting from with the words Hong Kong Police. And also, I try to keep editing as minimum as possible, as in I only added extra prepositions. So this is a sample sentence that I created when I exhibited the piece. I also created a web version, which feel free to scan the QR code, and I also can pull this page up later for you to interact. So last month, I had the privilege and opportunity to show the piece at an art book fair in Hong Kong. I show it through Scene Coop. They're a scene collective in Hong Kong, and they were exhibiting all these protest scenes that they collected from around the world. And it was an incredibly humbling and rewarding experience to show the piece there, because it's the first time that I got to show any of these protest-related work in Hong Kong. It was really interesting to see the responses and also see how people interact with the piece. Some of the sentences that participants made include Hong Kong police needs to say sorry, Hong Kong police ruins future, Hong Kong police close to an end. I also find it really interesting that aside from creating sentences, people were also rearranging the magnets to create protest slogans and also symbols. Here in the middle, that's Guang for Hong Kong. So it's part of a popular protest slogan, meaning liberate Hong Kong. And the second half of it is revolution of our times. 7/21 refers to July 21st, and that's when the mobster attack on the subway commuters happened. And at the time, there was a live stream, and people saw that no one was there to help those being attacked. And in fact, there's a video showing 2 police officers leaving the scene, and so people were really angry at the police. On the last day of the exhibit, I saw someone creating the acronym ACAB. There's also Fuck Popo. Popo is police. This was L9. So L referred to a Cantonese meaning fuck, and 9 sounds like a Cantonese word that means dog, and protesters have been referring to the police as dogs. And this is Hong Kong independence. So as the movement continues, new slogans are being chanted at the rallies. This is one of them, where the first part is Hong Kong independence, and the second part is the only way out. It's also interesting to see sometimes people will suggest what to make. This was one of the results. So refers to a police officer who always responds during the press conference. So people have nicknamed him Officer So I learned a lot from exhibiting this piece, especially about forms of data representation and audience agency. I think that just because a piece is programmatically generated, it doesn't necessarily mean it should be or that it's better to be contained in a digital space. In this case, breaking out of that space and showing it in this physical form was a lot more successful than the web version. And I think that is because the audience do have a lot more agency, and I think that is something that's important to consider when you're creating a participatory piece. And certainly you could create something that's computationally very complex to accommodate for all of the possibilities, but I think even then, there are certain interactions you cannot accommodate for, and also in that case, the power still lies more on you as a creator rather than the audience. So this next project, Interpreted Narratives, is about media rhetoric. I was speaking with some friends of mine who are from mainland China, and they have noted how, because of the access of media is very different for them from that in Hong Kong, so their understanding of the protest in Hong Kong is also very different. I was also really interested in media representation. Here we have two articles, one by Global Times, which is a Chinese media, and the other by the Stand News on the right, which is a Hong Kong pro-democratic online media. So they're both reporting on the siege of Polytechnic University, which lasts for 2 weeks. And it happened because protesters were setting up roadblocks in keeping with a larger citywide plan to go on strike. And the university locates pretty close to a major cross-harbor tunnel. And so in response, the police blocked the university and basically announced that anyone caught leaving will be charged with riot. And that is an offense that you could spend up to 10 years in jail for. So you can see in Global Times, like so their angles are both very different, and even with the wordings, it's different. Global Times refer the participants as rioters, whereas Stand News use the words protesters. Global Times focus more on destruction, whereas the Stand News focus more on how the protesters escaped. They were roping themselves down these footbridges, and there are cyclists that came from other parts of the city to drag them to safe spaces. So I was really inspired by Alexandra Bell's work. She would edit these New York Times article to deconstruct language and imagery to show how media frameworks construct our understanding of race, politics, and culture. And originally, I had wanted to do something very similar, where I would just edit these articles with someone from mainland China. And that didn't quite work out, but it got me to think about how I could create a flexible data collection system in order to understand how we read and understand something. Because I feel like a lot of times, even when we read the same situation or the same information, we could have very different interpretation. So what I end up doing is that I read a lot of articles about the siege of Polytechnic University, and I took bits and parts from 8 of them, both from pro-China media and pro-Hong Kong media, and I compiled that into my own article. And I created this exercise that I sent out to participants. And I asked them to do 3 things. First, I asked them to select the 3 most important sentences in the article. Then I asked them to put 3 keywords they associate with the article, as well as select a headline image. I also asked them if they've been following the protests and if they've been to or lived in Hong Kong. So after you complete the exercise, you could see all the results that are actually drawn from a database stored in Firebase. So there are some considerations that went into creating this project. First being language. So I only selected English articles and not Chinese articles, even though the first time I sent this project out, I had only sent it to participants from China and from Hong Kong. And that is because a lot of times when Hong Kong media report in Chinese, they use colloquial Cantonese that isn't very accessible to those from mainland China, and vice versa. When Chinese media report in Chinese, they use a lot of terminologies that are easily identifiable. And so I don't necessarily want my participants to know that what I'm doing, and I also want the article to read as cohesive. The second thing is that I did not include any international media, so I only use Chinese and Hong Kong media outlets because I feel like that will bring in a whole different dimension. And the third thing is I was I try to be careful and not asking any identifier questions. That is, I didn't ask people where they're from. I only asked them if they've been following the protests and if they have lived or been in Hong Kong. And that's because I don't want to make any assumptions about people's background and their answers. And in fact, when I sent the exercise out, I asked my participants to please complete it, but don't tell me when you have, just so I won't know who answered what from the timestamp. So these are the projects that I started last term, and I think something that was really significant to me was that after creating these projects, someone approached me and said that they really appreciate these projects and they wish they were also creating these projects, but they're not in a safe space to do so. And that is a comment that really struck me because I realized I am in a very privileged position. I could still be creating these work without being in any immediate danger. And the second is that I'm the only Hong Konger in my year in my program. So a lot of times it does feel a little bit alienating, and I have just been in this tunnel vision creating these projects. I wasn't sure if any of these projects would resonate with anyone. And the third thing is that I realized someone like that is exactly my target audience. Someone who may not opt for traditional means of resistance because either it doesn't appeal to them or they're not in a position to do so. And I think a lot of why I started creating these projects has to do with my undergrad experience when I moved from Hong Kong to the States for my undergrad. And I remember that time it was during Black Lives Matter, and I was really impressed at my classmates because they're very vocal and just really brave and articulate about what they believe in. And I remember at that time, I just felt very much of a coward because I couldn't do so. And it's only after starting to work in this way that I realized there are also other ways for me to express these thoughts and talk about social and political issues. So more recently, I've been thinking about different ways to look at the protests from a wider perspective. I came across this scene in the book fair in Hong Kong, and I just think it's really amazing. So it's called The Chronic. It's published by a South African publisher called Chimaranga. And this is a scene about critical cartography. And I think the reason why I think it's so compelling is because a lot of times when we think about mapping and think about data viz, we immediately think about what tools we should use. Should we be using GIS? Should we be using D3? That we forget that mapping and data viz can also look like this. And I think that's also something very human in this pencil hand-drawn diagrams. So I got inspired and I started creating my own diagrams of the people involved and the strategies used in the protest. And it was a lot trickier than I thought it would be, even though I know what I wanted to put on paper. It was tricky to think about how I should plot people's relationship, what should the hierarchy be, and if there should even be a hierarchy. And these are some sketches that I made while I was in that process. And this is sort of where I arrived at for now. So in the middle, I have the frontliner with the nonviolent protesters, and the only difference between them is one will confront the police. And I also have the medics with them, and these are the groups of people you would see at a protest site. And then in the middle ring, I put the different protest strategies, including communications such as Telegram, LIHKG, which is referred to as Hong Kong Reddit. And then I have documentation, as well as finance and everyday life protest strategies. And also as the movement continues, you would see that these group of people not only work on issues pertaining to the protests, but also other social issues such as coronavirus most recently. So I find this diagram quite helpful in terms of, for myself, making a mental mind map, and also for me to talk to other people about the process, especially for those who may not have much context. And it also helps to explain the complexity of the protest, but obviously there are a lot of information that are still missing from this diagram. I want to spend a bit of time talking about my experience going back home in December. So this is one of the first photos that I took when I went back. It is of a Lennon Wall in the neighborhood that I live in. And so Lennon Wall were first, in the context of Hong Kong, was first set up in 2014 during the Umbrella Movement, where people would put these post-it messages of support for democracy, freedom, universal suffrage. And this time around, people have set up Lennon Walls across the city. And this time when I went back, I saw a lot of these walls being painted over haphazardly. So the reason why I find this image really striking is that I think it's very telling of how the administration has been dealing with the protests, especially how they're willing to write off an entire young generation. And I also think that it speaks to this unspoken and overwhelming amount of hurt and pain that you could feel in the city. In fact, in a recent study, it showed that 1 in 4 Hong Kongers have PTSD symptoms during this time of social unrest, and that is at a rate comparable to those who have experienced large-scale natural disasters and terrorist attacks. I think a lot of times when we think about protests or social movement, we focus a lot on the strategies, on the technology, on the tools or objects that we forget about the people behind them. And the reason why I have been so interested in narrative reconstruction and trauma reconciliation is that I think the ability to craft your own narrative, especially creatively, is something that has been really empowering for me, at least, and especially empowering when you're up against a power that is much larger than you. But obviously, I do also have to acknowledge the limitation of these projects that I've been creating, and perhaps there's no technology, tools, or project that could help fix. So when I was in Hong Kong, I had wanted to go to this protest event, and I remember walking out of the subway station, and I saw 30 or so riot police, and I got really freaked out and almost did not join the event. And I think at that moment, I felt really useless because what I had experienced is what Hong Kongers experience every single day. And so at that moment, I was thinking, who am I to really be talking about restorative approaches? Who am I to be talking about resistance when I'm scared of that? But nevertheless, in terms of next step and continuing with these projects, I'm thinking of creating a toolkit and a book summarizing these methodologies I've used. Perhaps it will only be useful to me, and it definitely won't be a one-size-fits-all solution, but I hope that it could give people an idea to start finding their own strategies in embracing chaos. So lastly, but most importantly, there are a lot of people I would need to thank. Without their help, none of these projects would be possible, and I would like to especially thank Genevieve. Most of the projects that you saw just now are started or completed in her data art class last term. And also thank you for participating in Community Day NYC for this opportunity. And if you're interested in more of these work or other projects, this is my website and contact information. And I'm going to open up for questions, discussions. Thank you.
At the gallery showing in Hong Kong, were you surprised by people taking the art in a different direction than you designed it for, or?
Yeah, I certainly was surprised, and I think so. The exhibit lasts for 4 days, and it was only at the second day that I think people started rearranging it. And at first I was, oh wait, what's going on? But then I think that's actually the success of the piece, how people are arranging. And I think in the very last day, the last photo that you saw, it happened when there was actually a rally happening outside in the area where the museum's at, and the police had fired tear gas midday. And so I think a lot of that sentiment is also reflected in people's interaction. And I think the piece in conjunction with that happening was really interesting.
Yes. One of the really powerful things here is you sort of choosing to stay with this theme and just let it continue to unravel and lead you in the direction. And I'm a little curious how that ended up happening for this work. I know the theme is very personal, but like part of that path of unraveling throughout this theme and continuing to roll with it, we find is really interesting to me. So I'm just curious how that felt for you.
So I think it all started during the summer. So both during the Umbrella Revolution, which is in 2014, and also this time. Both times I've been here in the States when it happened. So both times I feel really disconnected and just like learning about everything from my friends. And I think like this time around, I did feel sort of this urgency that I needed to do something. And I think over the summer, there was also an open call in the program that I was in to write articles. And I kind of wanted to write an article about technology and social movement. So that's kind of where I started thinking about this. And I have been working with Clay Shirky, one of the people that I listed earlier, to start writing on the article. And I remember he was asking me if these will, if the article and other projects will be my thesis. And at that time, I was like, no, that is like too personal. I'm absolutely not doing it. But then he was like, are you sure? And then I'm like, okay, yeah, you're right. So I think like as the movement continued, I'm just like, and as I started writing that article, everything just started. And then once I started, I'm like, okay, I can't stop. Yeah. But currently, I'm kind of like at a pause in terms of thinking how to move things forward. But yeah, so. Yeah.
Actually, I was wondering if the articles that you used were of similar length or very different length, and how would that affect your projects?
Yeah, the article for, is it?
For either the On Your Mind one or the ones that you use for narratives?
Yeah, so for this one, I don't exactly remember all the articles length, but I think when I was compiling the article, I tried to pick like certain sentences, and so it's not overly proportional towards one article or the other. And also, I asked a friend who is not from China, not from Hong Kong, completely out of the context, to read my compiled article to see if it's kind of like veering towards one side. And it was interesting that he actually commented, "Oh, this seemed very against the protester," because I guess like when I was compiling the article, I was like kind of overly aware, and so I went back and edited it. And as for the On My Mind project, I think it really depends on whether it's a direct search or social media. And I think as the movement continues, I also see my mode of access change. In the beginning, a lot of it is through direct search, so that usually goes along with articles. But then later on, it's mostly through social media, so much shorter. And I think that also it's kind of like as the movement continue and as I kind of feel burned out, that mode of access also change.
Thanks for your talk. It was wonderful. I'm curious to know, like, your work spans like kind of on the spectrum between like reporting, journalism, and media art, and creative technology. Do you feel the need to be explicit about these topics? And you touched on it just a second ago, but given that like you're working with journalistic media incorporated into like media art projects, do you feel like you need to state your assumptions or stance clearly, or do you kind of also between saying from more observational and critical perspective versus
I think it does vary with different projects. In the interpretive narrative project, I definitely try to sort of be as neutral as possible and be aware of that. But then for I guess for like the magnet piece, it was like very obvious what my stance would be. And I think just also because maybe I don't come from that journalism background, I may not have as much of that baggage in terms of working with these projects. But that's also something that I've been like thinking about, and I think just because I am showing these work in a media art context, I
may not have like been as clear about my stance up front. Like for example, with the interpreted narrative piece, I also only towards the very end tell my participants like what's really happening.
First of all, great talk. Thanks so much for presenting works here. Can you speak to some technologies or queries that you use for generating your markup channels?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for that one, for this project, I was mostly working in Python in Jupyter Notebook, and a lot of the techniques I learned from Alison Parrish. She has a lot of really amazing resources online, and they're written up pretty clearly so you can follow through. So a lot of it is kind of like dealing with pronunciation of words, and then like finding most common like noun, verb, adjectives. So I kind of started off with that, finding the most frequently used words and sound, and then I kind of created these structures, and I was just like testing it out. And so once I created sort of a structure like that, I could just feed in the sentence and just refresh and generate a lot of different examples. And it's through many tries that I created the generative piece that I read earlier. Are there more questions? Cool. Well, thank you very much for coming. And if you have more questions, then feel free to drop me on. Thank you.